Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Tyndall, Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, where our mission is to foster curiosity and a spirit of discovery in visitors of all ages, enhancing public understanding of and appreciation for the natural world, science, and human cultures. This mission in mind, I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's Evolution Matters lecture, co-sponsored by the Peabody Museum and the Harvard Museum of Natural History. Tonight's featured scholar is Dr. Carol Hooven, who will discuss her recent book, T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. She will begin the program with a brief overview of the book's contents, followed by a conversation with Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions anytime during the program. And at the end of the presentation, our speakers will address as many questions as time allows. I would like to take a moment to recognize Drs. Herman and Jones Suit for their generous sponsorship of the Evolution Matters lecture series. They have sponsored this series for the past 10 years, and it is their support that allows us to present and record these lectures. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's faculty moderator. Daniel Gilbert is interested in how human beings navigate the complexities of time and social life. More specifically, Professor Gilbert is captivated by a single fact: the world is not as it appears. And he uses science to uncover the illusions people have about the world, themselves, and each other. Professor Gilbert has won numerous awards for his research and teaching. His popular book, Stumbling on Happiness, spent 6 months on the New York Times bestseller list, sold over 1 million copies worldwide, and was awarded the Royal Society's General Book Prize for Best Science Book of the Year. He hosted and co-wrote the award-winning Nova television series, This Emotional Life, which has seen by more than 10 million viewers in its first airing. Wow. In the last few years, he has appeared in a series of television commercials meant to help Americans overcome the psychological obstacles to saving for retirement. He is a contributor to Time, the New York Times, and NPR's All Things Considered. In 2014, Science named him one of the world's 50 most followed scientists on social media. His TED Talks have been seen by more than 15 million people and remain among the most popular of all time. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gilbert, who will provide introductions for tonight's featured scholar. Thank you.
Well, Brenda, thank you for that gracious and far too long introduction. Good evening, friends. I'm Dan Gilbert, and I am just delighted to be here this evening to talk with my colleague, my good friend, Carol Hooven, who's a biological anthropologist here at Harvard and who has written this wonderful new book called T, The Story of Testosterone. Now, as a scientist who writes books, I have a lot of friends who write science books, and I dutifully read them all. But I can't remember reading one that I thought was more fascinating, more beautifully written, or better researched than T. Carol sent it to me a few months ago, so I sat down one morning, intending to read the first few pages, and 5 hours later, I was still sitting in the same chair because I couldn't put it down. It's simply one of the best books about human nature I've ever had the pleasure to read. And that's why I am so grateful that Carol has agreed to join us tonight to talk about her book with me and with all of you through the question and answer function on Zoom. Under the assumption that not all of you have had the great pleasure I've had of reading this book, we thought we would ask Carol first to give a brief overview of the book, and then we will jump into conversation about it and just see where that takes us. So let me turn the stage, or I guess that's the camera, over to Carol.
Thank you so much, Brenda and Dan, for that incredible introduction. I'm very moved and I really appreciate it. And I'm thrilled to be here with you. And thank you so much for having the conversation with me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what I'm going to do is just give not even really an overview of the book. I'm just going to pick out a few highlights from the book just to give you a taste of what it's about and my approach. And this is just going to be very short, 15 to 20 minutes, just to give you a feel of what I'm doing in the book. All right. Can everybody see that okay? Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Okay. So I'm just going to get started, and I want to give you some idea of where I'm coming from and how I got interested in testosterone in the first place. So like a lot of people I know at Harvard, like a few people I know, and I encourage a lot of my students to do the same thing, have no idea what you want to do when you graduate from college. Go do a bunch of different things, travel a lot, read a lot of interesting books. That's what I did. And that process did take me about 10 years till I figured out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I knew that I wanted to try to understand the evolutionary origins of human behavior. So I'm going to make a long story short. I do describe more of this little bit of a journey in the book. I applied to Harvard so that I could learn more about the evolutionary origins of human behavior. I applied to the graduate program in biological anthropology after I quit my job, and my application was rejected. So I had and that's partly because I really had no experience in the field, as they call it. And I really wanted to get some experience studying wild animals. And I was extremely fortunate to be offered an opportunity to go out to Uganda for what was supposed to be a year to study wild chimpanzees at the Kibale Chimpanzee Project that was founded and run by Richard Wrangham, who was a Harvard primatologist. And I ended up working with him. So the time that I was out there was 1998 and 1999, and there was all war is bloody, but there was a war going on in the region that was extremely bloody and violent. And so my family was extremely nervous. My friends were very nervous, but I was really motivated to go out there. But the reason that I had to leave after 8 months is because of the level of violence. It was escalating, and especially Westerners were under specific threats, although people all around me were, not all around me super close to me, but in that region were subject to violence. So I ended up being evacuated after 8 months. So there was a lot of, I will say, violence in the area that I was in, which was political violence. But what was interesting was the aggression, the physical aggression that I saw while I was spending time with the chimpanzees in the forest. So every day I followed chimpanzees around, and I'm just gonna, again, long story short, one thing that really struck me about my time with the chimpanzees was the sex differences in the behavior of the chimps that so strongly paralleled sex differences in human behavior. And chimpanzees, of course, and wild animals in general, don't share any aspect of human culture. So when you see these kinds of parallels, at least when I saw these kinds of parallels, that really stimulated in me the desire to understand the evolutionary and hormonal origins of these sex differences. And that's how I ended up sort of homing in on testosterone. And that's what I ended up doing when I eventually did have my second application to Harvard was accepted, and I started work on sex differences and testosterone. And there was one incident that I described in the book in detail that I witnessed that really illustrated these parallels in a kind of disturbing way. And this was when that chimp that you just saw before, Emoso, who's pictured here, beat Utamba, the female chimp that you just saw, who was holding on to her baby, trying to protect her baby, while he beat her for 9 minutes. And that was a really long, aggressive observation for me. So to see him beat her up for 9 minutes, I didn't understand why. Later, I learned why, and I talk about some of the reasons for that in the book also. But this got covered by the media in this very sort of cringy, anthropomorphic title. But the point is here that there are these very strong parallels to human behavior that are undeniable. And I'm pictured there in Time magazine with Richard Wrangham, because this male dominant chimp, Emoso, he was the alpha male, used a stick as part of this beating. And that had not been witnessed before. No other researchers apparently had ever seen a non-human primate use a stick as a weapon in this way. So it did seem very human-like in some ways, but again, no human culture. So when we do look at human sex differences and aggression, there's lots and lots of data. It's not something that's very easy to measure, but one thing we can do is look at crime statistics. This is just one example of some of the data I have in the book. And what it shows clearly, if you just look on the left, you see male rates of crime. And if you look on the right, you see female rates of crime. And what you see, first of all, is that there is a whopping sex difference, especially when it comes to the most violent crimes like rape and murder. So the more violent the crime, the larger the sex difference in every single culture studied. So we have significantly, dramatically lower rates of physical aggression and violence in females, but what you see is the opposite trend, that as the sort of aggressive, physically aggressive component to the crime declines, the proportion of female involvement increases, like we see in crime. So we do have this parallel sex difference between humans and the chimpanzees, and also many non-human animals. We see that there's consistently higher rates of physical aggression in males. There's also differences in sexual behavior, and that parallel to some degree what we see in non-human animals. I have a lot in sex in the book, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I'm really going to focus more on aggression. So just again, very briefly, what is testosterone? It is evolution's tool to help male animals convert energy into offspring, which often requires aggression. All of us are designed by evolution to convert energy into offspring as efficiently as possible. So testosterone helps our bodies, especially male bodies, sort of know how to direct that energy in terms of developing the physical and the behavioral traits necessary to maximize that process. And I'm going to use the term reproductive success. So how to take the energy that we get from the environment, use it to shape our bodies and our behavior at all different stages in life, very early in life, including the prenatal stage, through in adolescence, and then in adulthood. What you're seeing here is a picture of red deer. These are male red deer stags. This is during the mating season, and this is a drawing that my brother-in-law did, and he did all the drawings for the book based on a photograph I took from the Isle of Rum. And I'm going to show you another picture from that, which is the site of another long-term, it's a long-term research site on red deer. And I went to see them during the rut, which is the mating season. So I got to go out to this beautiful island off the west coast of Scotland to see testosterone in action in these seasonal breeders, where it controls the expression in a seasonal manner of aggression and libido, and even the development of the antlers, which are weapons that male animals have, at least red deer, have on their heads to use to basically try to kill each other. And this is all testosterone mediated. So during the breeding season in the fall, the testes sort of come online, they start producing sperm, the stags become aggressive where they had been peaceful when testosterone was low outside of breeding season, and their antlers get sharp. So testosterone is coordinating this suite of adaptations, the expression of traits that allow them to compete for mates. And you have weaponry, and you have the motivation to fight for mates, to actually have sex, and to be ultra aggressive to fight for mating opportunities. And this is a polygynous species that are seasonal breeders. And this is a photo I took from my little lookout point. And you can see the dominant male, Wisdom 11, Emoso is the chimp. Wisdom 11 here on the left, he was the most successful male that season. It's called holding. He was holding 20 hinds in his harem. And you can see just the physical differences, first of all, between them. He has this, much larger body size, weaponry. They are much smaller and they're focused on eating because that's what they need to do to reproduce. They need to take in energy and they need to stay safe and healthy and live a long, healthy life. Estrogen helps to promote that. Testosterone promotes what the male here needs to do, which is fight for females and territory. So testosterone also makes humans different. It's just very clear that it upregulates aggression and certain sexual behaviors in non-human animals, and it makes us different too, on average. So I don't want to keep repeating on average, but I'm talking about sex differences, but I don't mean, especially when it comes to complex behaviors, that all males are like this and all females are like that. There's lots of overlap between the sexes in most of the traits I'm going to be talking about. What I'm interested in explaining are large patterns of behavior that we observe in humans and trying to understand that using an evolutionary perspective and looking at testosterone as the mechanism that helps to modulate the expression of these relevant traits. So what you're seeing here are two random humans that I just picked off the internet. And I just wanted to illustrate how similar our sex differences are in some ways from non-human animals, but also how different. So here you have typical sex differences in that the male is larger, has more muscle mass, has facial hair, has a receding hairline, and he's just hairy, period. He has hair here on his arms. The woman is smaller and more delicate, and she's shorter. Her body size is smaller. She has less musculature. Of course, on average, you can see these patterns reversed in plenty of people too. So what is the role of testosterone in these types of physical difference? Do we have different genes that are expressed or what? How does this work? So I think this is fascinating, and I go into a lot more detail in the book, but I just wanted to give you a little taste of how it is that testosterone and other steroid hormones like estrogen can coordinate these incredibly sort of large processes that take a long time. Like I have a 12-year-old son, he's starting to go through puberty. And it is testosterone that is sort of in charge of coordinating all these incredible changes that he's going to go through that are going to take him from being a boy to being a man like the one you saw, although he's not a dark hairy, he probably won't be hairy. Anyway, so it's testosterone that can coordinate those systems. And the reason that it can do that is because, first of all, it is a steroid molecule. So it's a derivative of cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid, and testosterone itself is a lipid. And that means it's lipophilic, which means that it's fat loving and it can dissolve in fats, which means that the hormone can freely cross, first of all, the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain and shape neural development and function starting in utero, and have evidence that that actually happens and helps to differentiate males and females. And then, but the way that it does it is carried around the blood. This is the cell wall here. This is a cell. This is the nucleus. The steroid crosses right through the cell membrane, and it can go right into the nucleus of any cell. So anywhere blood goes, hormones are going. They're just broadcast from endocrine glands into general circulation. They interact with any cell that has a receptor. So this cell has an androgen receptor. The testosterone interacts with that receptor. It goes right into the cell nucleus, and it can alter, by interacting with DNA, the hormone receptor complex here can alter the rate at which proteins are produced from various genes. So it generally upregulates gene transcription. So what you see here is the testosterone levels throughout development. And right here we have puberty, roughly. I mean, this is where puberty starts. So I just wanted to show you that it is testosterone altering gene expression that is responsible for, say, the fact that this guy has a beard and larger muscles and a receding hairline. It's not that he has different genes. Males and females have almost identical genes. We have some very small differences, but the differences that we see in our phenotypes are almost all due to the fact that testosterone, especially the ones that we see as a product of puberty, testosterone is altering gene transcription. And that's what causes all of these differences that you see. So it's not different genes, it's testosterone's incredible power to control the way that proteins are produced. Okay, so I mentioned there were these different stages that testosterone works at, and most of us can see that boys and girls behave differently. People have a lot of different ideas about why that is. And I'll just say right here, it is gene environment interactions. There's always a relationship between our genes, our hormones, our biology, you could say. It's more complex than that, but we are expressing all of that within a given environment. So it's never one or the other, it's always both. However, testosterone is very high in male animals, including humans, prenatally, and in this case, also perinatally, around birth here, but it's very high prenatally. And this is the time where testosterone is acting on the brain to masculinize behavior. And we know that in many non-human species, just like little boys in humans, the juvenile males like rough and tumble play. This is a very, very common behavior, and it seems to be fun for them. They wrestle, they pin each other down. My son is still doing this, and it's much more unusual for girls to do this. It is regulated by testosterone. We know that from experiments in non-human animals. We cannot experiment in humans, but we do have some cases that we can look at where, for instance, girls are exposed to higher rates of testosterone in utero than usual. And I should say that this behavior is practice, as most play is, for adult behaviors that are necessary for reproduction. And in this case, males need to know how to compete with each other and struggle for dominance and be aggressive. And they're learning that in juvenility, and humans do that too. So one kind of study that I wanted to just give you an example of, and this has been replicated very widely, is on girls who have unusually high levels of testosterone in utero. And it's a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So these girls, their hormone levels are treated at birth. So the only difference in terms of their brains is that they're exposed to high levels of testosterone in utero. And what you're looking at here is a study, and this is a common paradigm in these studies, where researchers take, in this case, we're just going to look at the girls who have CAH and girls who do not have CAH, and they look at the difference in their play preferences. In this case, girls who have CAH spend more time choosing to play with toys that other boys prefer. That boys' toys just means toys that boys prefer to play with. So here we have trucks and tools and things like that. So girls who are exposed to higher levels of testosterone in utero have more boy typical play style and spend more time with boys' toys than the unaffected girls. The girls who don't have CAH spend less time with boys' toys and much more time with girls' toys. So we have lots of evidence in humans that these girls have higher rates of rough and tumble play in addition to these kinds of toy preferences. So there's good evidence that sex differences in non-human animals and in human animals, and in humans, in exposure to testosterone in utero masculinize behavior in ways that can promote potentially aggressive behavior in adulthood. And this view that I have, that testosterone is really important and powerful in explaining sex differences, is not always popular. And there's a lot of pushback on that view. And I just am quoting two authors here. One is Katrina Karkazis, who wrote a book on testosterone and is quoted in The Guardian as saying, when people think about testosterone, aggression is one of the first things that comes to mind. But when you look at the evidence, there's not good evidence at all. And then Angela Saini, who wrote, I think, a very good book called Inferior, except I disagree with her about the testosterone part. There are few psychological differences between the sexes, and the differences seen are heavily shaped by culture, not biology. This is just a sample of the T skeptics, but there's a fair number of books and articles and talks where it's mostly women who seem to believe that culture, rather than something like testosterone or evolutionary pressures, is much more important in shaping sex differences. And I would argue that both are incredibly important, and in some way culture is more important than biology, but only because biology is important. So let me just explain what I mean. I showed you the data on sex differences in violent crime. If culture didn't matter, then we would have roughly the same level of violent crime that is committed by males roughly everywhere, because men would just be expressing their natures, right? So, but that is not what you see. You see differences by culture. In every country, however, males have much higher rates of violent crime than females. There is no exception to that. So the sex difference remains, but the extent to which males are basically allowed or motivated to express that violent or aggressive nature is really a function of culture and environment, socioeconomic status, religious norms, laws, traditions. All of these things have an enormous impact on the extent, on the size of sex differences in sexual behavior and in aggressive behavior, but it's really culture and environment that can push those behaviors around. And that's why I think it's so important to understand the interaction of culture and biology so we can better understand how to stem some of those more problematic extremes of male behavior. Most men are not murderers. And what I'm talking about here is these patterns of sex differences that we really want to understand. And I just wanted to end on a quote from Sherry Berenbaum, who is a professor of psychology at Penn State. Rather than rejecting biological differences, we must seek to reveal the nonsense in the arguments that brain and behavioral sex differences justify discrimination, segregation, and differential treatment of the sexes. And I love that quote, because what she's saying is that we can treat people equitably, we can work on reducing discrimination, we can try to increase equality between the sexes, et cetera. And those goals are not incompatible with understanding biology and biological differences. In fact, in many ways, it depends on our having a deep and thorough and accurate understanding of human nature and how it works. And yeah, we can skip that other slide. So I hope I've convinced you that testosterone is an important part of human nature in animals and in non-human animals and in us. And I just want to give a shout out to Felix Byrne, my brother-in-law, who did all the art for the book. And thank you so much for having me. I know this is just a quick little overview here. Thank you to the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture for hosting the discussion. And thank you so much in advance to Dan for talking with me about testosterone.
Well, Carol, thank you very much. And if only we were all gathered in a big room, you'd be hearing a great round of applause from the nearly 200 people gathered to hear your thoughts and learn about your book. Thanks so much for the presentation. We get to talk so often, you wouldn't believe that I still have questions about your area of expertise, but darn it, I do. And now I get to ask a few. You referred to critics as T-skeptics. I like that term. One of the arguments that I often hear them make against the importance of testosterone in regulating human behavior is that individual differences in levels of testosterone actually don't seem to matter in places where it seems to most of us they should. For example, as you note in your book, male athletes with high testosterone don't outperform those with low testosterone. And according to the skeptics, that and related findings suggest T really isn't a terribly important determinant of behavior. I wonder if you can clarify specifically, explain to us where T does matter and where it doesn't.
Okay, well, if you're going to get me to ask where T does matter, I'm never going to shut up. But I'll start with your question. That is such a great question. And you're right, this is one of the points that the skeptics make, and they're correct, right? So that's why, part of why it's really effective is because it's true that largely, in some cases, there is a relationship. If you're looking among adult healthy men, in some cases, there's a relationship between their testosterone level and sports performance. But in general, there isn't. So the point is, if I wish I could see everyone here in the audience, and I could if I could somehow guess all the testosterone level, I'll just start with the men, and then we can talk about the women, and we can even talk about testosterone in women. But suppose I knew the testosterone level of all the healthy men in the audience. The point is, it really wouldn't give me any more information about who has the highest libido, who's the best athlete, who's the most competitive. This is really a myth that there are these kind of dose-response relationships among men between testosterone and behavior, or even things like athletic ability. And the reason, and we see this also in non-human animals in terms of libido, especially, that what you really need is a male typical level of testosterone to show male typical levels of muscle mass, strength, power, sex drive, preference for a high number of sexual partners or sexual variety. Those things all go up when you get into the male range of testosterone, which is 10 to 20 times as much as females have. And what's interesting is that it appears that it's necessary for some of these behaviors for those high levels of testosterone to be present in utero and in puberty and adulthood. But when we look for these little fine-tuned differences, they're not super predictive of much in men. And that allows some of the critics to say, look, testosterone isn't related to athletic ability, because in men, it's not, but it is the biggest driver of the sex difference in athletic ability, which is massive. Men, if you're comparing highly trained elite men and women, men just blow women out of the water in almost every sport, not every one. And of course, there are exceptions, but that is a function of testosterone in puberty and its effects on muscle mass, on hemoglobin, which powers the muscles, height, bone strength. All of these things contribute to athletic ability, but it's really getting over that threshold that makes a big difference. So I hope that answers your question.
It's a little bit like saying height doesn't matter in basketball because the difference between the 6'8" guys and 6'10" guys is insignificant. So height has nothing to do with basketball ability.
That's exactly right. Because once you're good enough, once you're part of the 0.000, whatever it is, 1% of the population who's good enough to be in the NBA, yeah, height doesn't predict anything because there's a bunch of short guys who can like run around under the legs of the big tall guys, right?
Yeah, and short, of course, means 6 feet tall. One of my favorite chapters, not my favorite, I'm going to tell you my favorite.
Okay.
But one of my favorite, and certainly one of the most fascinating chapters in the book, is the one called T in Transition. And it is a chapter that simply couldn't have been written 20 years ago because it concerns the effects that testosterone has on people who are transitioning from male to female and vice versa, adults who are in the midst of transitioning. And you argue that these transitions provide some of the most powerful evidence for the effects of testosterone because it's being artificially increased or suppressed, which essentially makes cases like this natural experiments. I just wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what studies of people who are transitioning have taught us about testosterone, things we didn't know before.
Yeah, thank you. This, to me, even though I've been teaching about testosterone for a long time, and I sort of knew about these studies, this to me was one of the most powerful parts of researching the book for me personally and intellectually. I wanted to, yes, dive into the literature to try to understand, well, what is it like to go from a female level of testosterone, which is almost nothing, it's very, very, very low, to a male level of testosterone as an adult or even as a young person, but post-puberty. What is it like to make that change? How does it change our body? How does it change how we feel? And also to go in the opposite direction. What might it feel like to be have male levels of testosterone and then to shut that off And what kind of change? Does that just change the body? Does it change the mind? Is it profound? And yes, yes, yes. And so I wanted to interview some transgender people for that chapter and have them just tell me their personal experiences. So I interviewed a male to female transgender person, a female to male. I also interviewed a female to male and back, which is called detransitioning. So most people are very happy with their gender transitions, and she was not. But that was interesting because she could tell me what it was like to kind of live as a man with high testosterone and all the changes that brought, including to her voice, which really deepened it. What was that like for her to live as a man? And then she can tell me about it as a woman again. So that was interesting. And I think, I can't remember if I just left out, I also spoke to a female to male transitioner. And what they told me, and so I just have their words throughout the chapter, and what they told me was very consistent with what the scientific literature reports. And the most profound change, one of the most profound changes in terms of the sex differences that I'm interested in, that happened very quickly, even before physical changes happened. And I can talk about the physical changes, but they're really what you would expect. And I'll just say what those are, to go from female to male. So I showed you the picture of the male and female and said that testosterone is upregulating the genes that can be used to produce the proteins that would grow a beard. And I described the science of exactly how that works in the book, and how testosterone also causes the voice to change, et cetera. But though the reason that works is because female-bodied people or female-born people can respond to high levels of testosterone because they have the genes that testosterone can act on. So, like, if I were to undergo a gender transition and take high levels of testosterone, I would start to grow facial hair, my hairline would recede, I would increase in muscle mass, and I would end up looking, extremely masculine. My bones wouldn't grow, I wouldn't get taller, but my voice might drop depending on how old I was. But before those changes, the most pronounced change that people described was, in terms of sex and aggression, was the libido went, especially in the first couple years where you're going through something like a male puberty, libido goes through the roof. That is what the transgender people I talked to told me. And this is something that is all over the literature on the effect of transitions. And that, to me, is fascinating because, yes, I'm aware that there are differences in sex drive between the sexes, where males tend to have a higher sex drive, but to have people talk about what it felt like to go from sort of a female typical level of T and sex drive to, before there are any significant physical changes, to feeling this really strong preoccupation with sex. And to some, it was even annoying to some of them. At first, it takes some adjusting to change that way of being in the world. But that was profound to me because it gave me a kind of different way of thinking about male sexuality. And so I found that fascinating. And some people reported their experience of orgasm changed when they, especially when they blocked testosterone, their sex drive went down a bit. When people went from male to female, sex drive went down a bit. It doesn't go away. Females still have very strong sex drive, but it took on a different tone. It was described as not quite as urgent. And the experience of orgasm, which this is also typical of sex differences, evidently, this isn't found in every study, but it seems that there's some tendency for women and trans women who are blocking testosterone to have an orgasm that is more full body and lasts longer, and that the male or trans male orgasm for people who have high testosterone tends to be more acute and focused on the genitals and sort of shorter in time, sort of not lasting quite as long. So, and I should just also mention aggression, physical aggression tends not to change in the direction that you might expect. Some people report that anger levels change. Some people report that they're especially going from female to male and taking testosterone, that it inhibits the expression of the more vulnerable emotions. Crying basically almost stops for a lot of people, where they find it more difficult to cry, more difficult to access kind of what I would say are more vulnerable emotions. So you have some emotional changes, you have some sexual changes. Some people said that anger is the emotion they feel that is most salient. But again, that's, these changes really, really vary for everybody. These are just some of the signal through the noise. So to me, that's powerful evidence that this is not, this isn't just socialization. This is a very, very powerful hormone. And that's part of why people want to change their levels of testosterone and estrogen as part of gender transitions, because these are so powerful, not just physically, but also emotionally. And there's some evidence about cognitive changes, but that's not as strong. Sorry, that was a super long answer.
No, it was just what I was asking about. And it was a fascinating chapter, but also, I guess, extremely sensitive and engaging to me because of all the interviews you did. I had a sense of the experiences from the inside, not just from the outside as a dispassionate scientist, but it wasn't my favorite chapter. My favorite chapter was the first chapter. What I really loved about that chapter, well, so many things, but at the end, you squarely address the notion of biodeterminism. Many people, particularly non-scientists, worry about the general idea that if our behavior is driven by our biology, then we are prisoners of it. That behaviors like rape and murder are perfectly understandable and maybe even inevitable. You obviously do think biology plays an important role, but you don't buy those conclusions for a minute. And then you go on to do this masterful job, I thought, of explaining why. I just wonder if you would share some of your thinking about this general issue with everyone here tonight.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a big and important, it's such an important question. And it is not easy to answer. It is complicated. It can be threatening to acknowledge that we do on average have different natures. And again, I want to stress, I'm talking about aggression, which is a negative, it can be, it can also be positive in some instances. I'm talking about physical aggression, and I'm talking about extremes of physical aggression. These are problematic aspects of primarily, male behavior, and that's difficult to grapple with. So it does feel like if we say, wait a minute, this is something that the sex difference exists because of biological differences, because of differences in hormones, it could feel like, wait a minute, that legitimizes the behavior. That means men can get away with rape and murder because it's in their genes. So we have to live with it. It excuses their behavior. If this gets out to the public, then all hell is going to break loose, or it's already breaking loose and we won't be able to stem it. So, but suppose that is right. Suppose it's true that if people really understand human nature, and this is the truth about human nature, that we will fear the consequences of people's beliefs, right? Well, so what would you do? Would you not tell the truth? So no, I think we have to start with trying to understand reality. Reality isn't always comfortable. This is not comfortable. That's why the book is sometimes considered controversial, because there are some uncomfortable truths, and I'm in favor of trying to face them, trying to understand reality and how we can make, I hate to use this cliche, but make the world a better place by understanding how it works. And when you understand, in my view, that we do have different natures, that some of the most problematic behaviors, yes, are consequences of a predisposition that males to some extent have from the get-go. What do? We look at environmental changes that we can make, or cultural changes that can help promote the most positive aspects of male behavior, positive masculinity. What kinds of cultures have, say, higher rates of murder and violence? What's going on in those cultures? What's going on in the cultures that have really somehow stemmed the male, problematic aspects of male behavior? So we know that, first of all, we're not stuck with the kind of worst aspects of male behavior. We know that because, yes, while in every culture males commit more murders and rapes, that is the case. But in some cultures, there's very, very low rates because culture doesn't allow it, right? The environment somehow doesn't allow it. We have to figure out, and there's not always great solutions. Maybe caning in Singapore is not the best way to reduce physical violence, but it works, right? But so that's evidence that we're not stuck with, just everybody expressing their natures. Religion, tradition, laws, so just social expectations all play a huge role. So in my view, we need to expose the evidence, we need to talk about it, we need to understand how we can best shape society, become more active in fighting for laws that we think are going to make a difference. And I also am of the view that we shouldn't shame men for their natures, right? That we should be open in talking about the ways that we're different, what we're bringing to the table. What is shameful and what we do have to deal with is behavior, right? But I think we should open up a dialogue where men feel comfortable talking about how they feel, what their challenges are, in a way that women, I hope, also feel comfortable talking about our challenges. Maybe even given our different natures, but there shouldn't be shaming for how we feel. There should be dealing with the consequences of behavior. Sorry, I don't even know what you asked, but yes, I do. So we can't. Sorry. So we don't need to accept. The biological determinism idea is just false. Even if there's a predisposition for some particular kind of behavior, it doesn't have to be expressed. There's no get out of jail free card for men. We want to do a better job in science education and then teach people about the implications of biology so that they can understand responsibly kind of the implications of our different natures.
I think you may have just answered the question that I was thinking of ending with, which is to note that your book has garnered glowing reviews all over the world, and I follow your appearances in the media and social media, and I was quite surprised to learn that some of what you'd written had met with controversy. And I was going to ask if you thought there was really anything in your book that warranted controversy, or if you thought the controversies that I've seen on social media, for example, are really more a matter of misunderstanding than substantive disagreement. But maybe that's what you were just hitting on.
No, I think that there are sensitive topics that I'm getting into, and we're not used to having conversations about them. Conversations are being shut down. People do not feel able to disagree about some of these sensitive topics. And I think what we need to have to educate people, to allow, I guess I'll just say, I think when we shut down conversations about sensitive topics, like some having to do with transgender issues, differences of sexual development, et cetera, or if we try to deny reality to promote somebody's rights or the rights of a certain group of people, I think we're doing them a disservice, because I think that it is open conversation that allows us to understand each other and to have more compassion for how different people feel in the world and what their needs are and what their challenges are and how we can best support them. But when we're so busy sort of shutting people down and shaming them for having certain views or saying certain things that they truly believe and are trying to act in good faith, then I think there's so much misunderstanding, there's hostility, there's division. And I am somebody who just wants to understand people who are not like me. I am also a person who cares a lot about human suffering. And I think that the way to alleviate suffering is to understand what causes it, to allow people to express their views, to listen with compassion. When you judge and you shut down, we don't understand another person's reality and what they're experiencing in the world, and we can't have compassion for them. So I think compassion goes up as we learn about other people, and that's the way I'll just answer that one.
Well, it sounds like you probably have no use for Twitter. Well, look, I don't want to dominate this conversation, though I have. So what I should say is, let me stop dominating this conversation and invite some of the nice folks who are listening to jump in with their own questions. I have the difficult duty of reading them as I talk, but I've been paging through them. And let me find the one I was going to ask you first. There it is. It's from Niels. And the question reads, is there actually a trend for men to have lower levels of testosterone and women to have higher levels? If so, have those changes made a difference? And I assume that Niels means over the last 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, are average testosterone levels changing and merging towards each other in males and females?
So that's a really interesting question. It is not, I don't have as much expertise there as I do on kind of the evolutionary perspective. However, I am familiar with some of that literature, and that is correct. But so the Niels, was it Niels?
Yes.
Okay, so Niels is correct. And this is, there's a lot of data, and I believe that it's mostly in Western countries or more developed areas where the sex difference in testosterone levels is much larger than it is in smaller scale societies. So in smaller scale societies, male testosterone levels overall are much lower, and there tends not to be a huge peak and then a decline like you see among, say, in the United States or Britain, where you have more energy coming into the system overall. So you have a lot of energy, you have higher male testosterone levels that then decline over time. And you are seeing a trend, sorry, when I say over time, I mean across development, but then you're seeing a trend over time. And I'm not sure exactly what the time frame is. I think it's in the last, I'm just basically guessing, I think it's something like 10 years, 10 to 20 years maybe, where male testosterone levels are declining. It has to do evidently with phthalates, and I don't know exactly how that works. And I'm not aware of any, what I understand is that there may be some decline in sperm motility. However, I'm not certain about that, but I have read studies that show that. But that's a really big area of research right now, because that is a trend. I haven't heard that female testosterone levels are rising, but we haven't talked about female testosterone. That's a very interesting area. And I should say that females are much more sensitive to any even small changes in testosterone level, because we have so little to start with. If you increase female testosterone, you can see increases in muscle mass and athletic ability and facial hair with even very small increases. So that's a great question. It's a really interesting area of research, and I don't have the full answer there, but yeah, that is happening. And I don't know enough about why or what exactly the consequences are.
I'm glad you brought up testosterone in females, because several of the questions I'm reading ask about it from different ways. Sometimes they just say, what about testosterone in females? But one questioner, Arnaz, says, are there any factors that trigger high testosterone levels in females developing in utero?
Great. So that's Arnaz?
Arnaz, I believe.
Arnaz. Okay. That's a good question. So definitely the condition congenital adrenal hyperplasia is the condition where females have unusually high levels of testosterone that are secreted by the adrenal gland. So half of androgens, testosterone being an androgen in women, comes from their adrenal gland. So there are other sources also in the body of androgens, but mainly the ovaries and the adrenal glands, where in males, it's like 98% is coming from the testes. I should just say, we also make testosterone in our brains and in other parts of our bodies, as we also produce estrogen and many other tissues. So as far as what would cause testosterone to increase in female fetuses, there's not a lot. First of all, I should say, as I describe, probably in more detail than some people would like in the book, the measurement of female testosterone, even in adult women, it is typically with the traditional method that's used, which is radioimmunoassay, it is not accurate. There's a different method that needs to be used for accurate measurement because the levels are so low. So I don't, and another problem to lay on top of that is that it's very difficult to get accurate measurement of these very low levels of androgens, especially in utero, even in males, because you can't just sort of get right into the fetus to sample it. So there's different methods that people use. So I haven't seen literature on, I haven't seen much literature really on natural variation in fetal T in healthy females. And I think because of the problems that I just talked about. But if people are interested in testosterone action in women and what it does, I should do, or are you going to ask something else?
Oh, I have an endless number of questions, but
okay.
From answering the last one.
Yeah, no, I have been really interested in that question and just researched over many years, but particularly for the book, to make sure that I have all the information that's really available. And what I learned was that lots of researchers are looking for evidence that testosterone is important in women and that it sort of does something similar as it does in men. So one thing we didn't talk about is male-male competition and how testosterone levels can change in response to threat, or a competitive threat or an aggressive threat, whether it's physical or non-physical. And people have been looking for that in women. Do female testosterone levels change when they are competing? The answer is no. There's no evidence for that. We're very, very competitive. We tend not to be as physically aggressive or competitive, but females are extremely competitive. But what we know from non-human animals is that estrogen tends to be really important in sex, in aggression, and competition. We don't seem to have these changes in estrogen that are a function of competition, but estrogen is the really important hormone in females. Then there's a whole literature on testosterone supplementation in women, but that's a whole other question. So we don't really know a lot about it in females. It seems like you can get away with almost none and be perfectly normal.
Terrific. I have a question here that I had never thought of before, so I would love to hear the answer. It's Constanza. And the question is, please comment on the influence of male twins on female twins, especially as this is becoming more common with fertility drugs.
Yes, good. So again, so there is literature in non-human animals showing that when a female fetus shares the uterine environment with a male, she is then exposed to higher than average for her levels of androgens. And there's some masculinization of behavior in that case. I actually am not sure about that. It's a great question, and I feel like I should know the answer. I don't know off the top of my head the literature that would address that in humans. I think that there is some, and I think there are studies, but again, I'm not positive. I think there are some studies that show some masculinization of behavior, but I'm not positive. And this is something I now am going to go research after this talk. That's an excellent question. And I hadn't even thought of the sort of increase in that situation because there's more IVF right now. Yeah. So great question.
It is a great question. And, when you do find the answer, email me because I'm quite eager to hear. Adair asks, might lower levels of testosterone and how it's expressed in males be related to increasing environmental pollution that builds up in the body? We've all heard about the effect of environmental estrogens on women, But is there any side for males having to do with testosterone or?
Yeah, no, yes. And I think that's the same kind of question as the question just about declining testosterone. So I think that that's probably right. Again, that's really not an area that I cover in the book, and I'm not an expert on those, on phthalates and how they affect testosterone. But that is my understanding of what the part of the problem is. I think it's more complicated than that. And again, I'm not giving a great answer there, but that's, yeah, we need to understand what's going on in the environment and how it's affecting our fertility and potentially behavior. And I think that's really important to understand, particularly in men who may be trying to get pregnant or get their wives or girlfriends or somebody pregnant. So
presumably not both.
right.
Andres asks, what's the difference between bonobos and chimpanzees regarding their behavior and levels of testosterone?
Yes. So, wow, that's a great question. Bonobos, there's a lot of differences between bonobos and chimpanzees that are fascinating. And for one thing, chimpanzees much more often will use physical aggression to resolve conflicts, while bonobos will use, do you know what it is? Sex, right? So they're much more likely to use sex. They're also, males and females are co-dominant. So you don't have, like in chimpanzees, it's very clear that males, all adult males are dominant to all females. And in bonobos, females form stronger bonds and are more able to kind of stem high levels of male aggression. At least that's one of the theories. So there's strong differences in behavior. There's also a lot of differences in their development and the extent of sex differences in strength and body size. It's reduced in bonobos. And I do not understand, I've looked into this and I've talked to people who have researched testosterone levels in bonobos. We do not know enough at this point about what testosterone is doing in bonobos. What I do know is bizarre, and somebody's going to hopefully fill me in if they know more about this afterwards. But it is that juvenile bonobos have very high levels of testosterone. And I believe that it is the case that males and females have high levels of testosterone in juvenility. I believe also that there is not as strong a relationship between dominance and testosterone levels in bonobos as you see in chimps. And that's as far as I'm going to go there. I think there's work being done on testosterone in bonobos. Some of that is going on at Harvard. And we just need more research on that, because it's to me, it's a bizarre, unusual situation, especially to see the high testosterone in juveniles. And I don't know how to explain what it's doing. I'm not sure anybody does. If they do, they will let me know. So.
Indeed, I see we've run you past the top of the hour, which we promised not to do because I know you have other things you need to scoot for. So it's 7:02. Let me wind up and thank you so much, Carol, for appearing, and your marvelous book and your marvelous talk have educated and illuminated all of us. Thanks all of you on the webinar for coming and joining us this evening. Thanks very much to the Harvard Museums for sponsoring this talk. And I hope to see many of you at the next one. Cheers.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.